Hey guys, tonight we're traveling somewhere cold, somewhere very, very cold. Imagine a place where the ground steams from hidden lava tubes, the wind stings like it has opinions about your life choices, and nearly every house has at least one sheep, a story, and some mildly passive-aggressive legal advice. That's right, we're going to medieval Iceland. You wake up in a small turf house, ducking under a roof made of grass and driftwood beams. Outside, the volcanic soil crunches beneath your feet. The sky is a uniform grey, and the air smells faintly of fish, wool, and burning peat. There's no king here, no castles or knights in shining armor, just scattered farms, miles of lava rock, and one of the most strangely sophisticated legal systems in all of medieval Europe. Oh, and no one has a last name. That'll make court records fun. You probably won't survive this. I mean, unless you're into memorizing 3 generations worth of sheep theft law while getting frostbite in your left ear. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love seeing those. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a windswept hillside, past moss-covered rocks and sheep who look like they know your business. A raven caws from a crooked fence post. This is Iceland in the early Middle Ages, roughly the 10th century. It's a land of long shadows, longer winters, and surprisingly well-organized local governance. The Vikings who settled here from Norway and beyond didn't bring kings or nobles. Instead, they brought laws, lots of laws, and instead of a central ruler, they created a system where laws weren't written down at all, just memorized and passed on, like bedtime stories, but with more murder clauses. This system was called the GRGs, literally Grey Goose Laws, and while the full written version didn't appear until centuries later, its backbone already existed in these early days. But here's the catch: most people didn't read laws, they heard them. Every year, every one, or at least every male head of household with nothing better to do would gather at the Althing, Iceland's open-air parliament. And until then, the laws lived in your head, beside the grocery list and your aunt's wedding toast. You might think a society without written laws would be chaos, but somehow Icelanders made it work. They divided the island into Gogog districts, governed by chieftains called Goga. These weren't kings. They were more like influencer lawyers with sheep. You could choose which Gogi to follow, and if you didn't like one, you could switch allegiance. Imagine if you could unsubscribe from your local government. Tempting, right? So what did justice look like in this land of lava and long memories? Well, say your neighbor's goat wandered into your cabbage patch and ate everything. You didn't go bash their skull in, at least, not legally. You would gather witnesses, tell your local Gogi, and prepare your argument. If it was serious enough for juicy enough, it might end up at the ALTHING.R, the AL thing, a national event held every summer at Lyngvellir, a great rift valley where 2 tectonic plates meet. If you're picturing a stone courthouse with robes and gavels, forget it. This is more like a dusty music festival, but with legal drama instead of indie bands. Families camped out for days. People sold wares, traded news, and gossiped endlessly. And in the middle of it all stood the Law Rock. You'll hear more about that soon, but first, consider this. In a world with almost no written documents, the human brain became the archive. Your memory was your legal library. Everyone, from chieftains to farmhands, needed to know at least the basics how to resolve a land dispute, what counted as slander, and how many witnesses you needed if your neighbor's sheep suspiciously disappeared. Historians still argue whether this oral system was more democratic or just wildly chaotic. Some say it gave power to the people. Anyone with a good memory and a loud voice could participate. Others point out that it favored the rich, the eloquent, and the extremely petty. But one thing is clear: Iceland took its laws seriously, and not just because they had nothing better to do during 8-month winters. These laws were survival. In a fragile, icy land with few resources and many grudges, you couldn't afford endless blood feuds. So you learned the rules. You taught them to your children. And at night, when the wind howled and the peat fire crackled low, you might just whisper a statute or two to yourself, just to keep them fresh. The irony: despite all this memorization, some people still got creative with the rules. Legal loopholes were practically a national pastime. You'll meet one or two slippery characters soon enough. But for now, as you settle into your scratchy wool bedding inside a smoky turf house, you begin to understand. Here, in medieval Iceland, law isn't just something you follow, it's something you live. And yes, sometimes, something you take to bed. Asterisk, you squint into the summer sun as you join the slow-moving caravan toward Lyngva. Everyone's headed to the Elfing, the one time of year when disputes are aired, alliances renewed, laws spoken aloud, and teenage boys pretend to be lawyers because they've memorized 4 clauses about sheep fencing. You, however, are here to listen, maybe learn a thing or two, maybe figure out why someone brought a live goose in a wooden cage labeled Exhibit A. Lyngva is less a building and more a dramatic crack in the earth. Literally, it sits in a rift valley between the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates, and the land yawns open in long, jagged lines, like the earth itself is making room for Icelandic justice. You camp on the moss with dozens of others, sharing firewood and soup made mostly of dried fish and boiled onions. It's not great, but it's filling, and no one's sued the cook yet. By the time morning mist lifts, the Althing is in full swing. It's a little chaotic merchant's hawk-carved combs. Children chase each other between tents, and a skald with a lute is singing a very long song about someone's grandmother's famous lawsuit. But at the center of it all is the Lagberg, or Law Rock, and standing atop it, arms raised, is a man whose job you wouldn't want for all the fermented shark in the land. This is the leg skim with a law speaker. Every year, he recites 1/3 of Iceland's laws from memory, projecting his voice over the gathering with the help of wind and pure vocal spite. That means, in 3 years, the entire body of law has been spoken aloud. Think of it like a rotating audiobook, performed live, outdoors, and possibly during a hailstorm. There are no microphones, no parchment scrolls in hand. He's memorized the whole thing. If he gets it wrong, well, technically, it still counts. He is the law while speaking. It's not ideal, but it's very Icelandic, and people do listen. You sit cross-legged with a few others near the base of the Law Rock. Some are genuinely taking notes. Others are knitting while nodding, which may be the medieval equivalent of "I'm totally paying attention, I promise." Occasionally, someone will mumble a correction under their breath, but no one dares interrupt. Here's the thing: Iceland's legal system in this era had no centralized army, no jails, no executioners on government payroll. What it had was collective memory and community enforcement. You might not agree with a verdict, but everyone agreed to follow it because the alternative was endless blood feuds. And as charming as a saga about vengeance sounds, you really don't want your children's children dying in a fight that started over an overcooked seal roast. So when the law speaker recites a rule about property boundaries, something involving lava fields, ancestral ghosts, and whether a fence counts if it's made of whale bones, people listen. Because this is binding. This is official. And if you don't like it, well, you can take it up at next year's Althing. Good luck with that. Historians still argue whether the law speaker had true interpretive power or was more like a very eloquent parrot with a social role. Some suggest he had room to adjust the phrasing, adapt to current disputes, and subtly favor one side. Others think he was tightly bound by tradition and terrified of messing up in front of hundreds of sleep-deprived farmers. In any case, his performance is oddly mesmerizing. You find yourself lulled by the rhythm of the spoken law, the repeated phrases, the if-thens, the poetic structure meant to aid memory. It's like a SMR for medieval legal scholars. You begin to notice patterns. Phrases like "unless he be outlawed" crop up often. So do long clauses about when it's acceptable to chase someone off your land with a spoon, which you didn't think needed clarification, but here we are. And it's not just criminal law. There are rules about commerce, marriage, inheritance, insults, and sheep ownership so specific that they mention coat color and wool density. Some rules were clearly written in winter by bored people with too much time and too few neighbors. Eventually, the recitation ends, and the law speaker steps down, rubbing his throat and waving off offers of honey tea like a medieval diva. You stretch your legs and look around. No one's applauding, but people nod respectfully. A few debates break out quietly about what he meant by proper threshold or intentional stomping. It's Iceland. Interpretation is half the fun. Nearby, a man loudly declares that the law speaker forgot a clause about cow trespassing. He's promptly told to bring it up next year by a woman who looks like she'd win most arguments with just her eyebrows. You decide not to get involved. Later that evening, around a communal fire, someone retells the day's recitation with added commentary. There's laughter, mild exaggeration, and someone adds a verse in meter. The laws become story again, passed from ear to ear, a little distorted maybe, but still alive. And as you lie down in your tent, feet sticking out the end because tents back then weren't designed for anyone over 5'6", you start to understand something strange. The Althing isn't just a legal event, it's a national memory refresher. It's a social contract read aloud, and somehow, even without courts or jails or police, it keeps things from falling apart. Well, most things, you'll learn tomorrow just how weird justice can get in a land without locks. Asterisk. You wake with a crick in your neck and the faint scent of smoked lamb drifting through the camp. The Althing is still humming arguments carrying over from yesterday's sessions. Merchants shouting prices on seal oil lamps, and somewhere in the distance, a very persistent baby goat bleating like it's objecting to something on procedural grounds today. You're invited to sit with the law speaker's assistants, yes. Even he needs help. You'd think someone who memorizes thousands of lines would get a break, but no. His role comes with a small crew of scribes, advisors, and that one guy who corrects pronunciations, even though no one asked him to, as you settle in on a rock with a relatively low moss content. The law speaker himself arrives, trailing a robe that is more patch than fabric. He clears his throat still hoarse from yesterday and begins preparing for another round of recitations. Except today, It's not the grand stage atop the law rock. Today is for disputes. He moves between tents and rocks, leaning in close to hear each case. There's no courtroom, just grass, people, and the understanding that his word carries real weight. One of his aides hands him a carved bone tablet, more decorative than practical. Icelandic law isn't written yet, not in this century, but it's getting harder to keep it all straight. People are requesting written records more often. Some call that progress. Others call it cheating. You follow him to a shaded area where 3 men are quietly arguing over a boundary stone that might have been moved in a storm, or by a cousin, or possibly by elves, depending on who you ask. The law speaker listens, nods, and says something like, "If the stone was moved by man, it must be returned. If by storm, it must be accepted. If by elf, it depends on the mood of the hill." Everyone nods solemnly, even though that last part was clearly a joke. Probably, but not all cases are so light-hearted. A woman arrives with her brother in tow. Eyes sharp, voice calm. She's accusing a neighbor of theft, not of animals or tools, but of honor. You're about to scoff when you hear the details. He composed a slanderous poem, suggesting she behaved improperly with a visiting merchant. You expect the law speaker to brush this off. He doesn't, single quotes, because in Icelandic law, poetry is dangerous. A well-placed verse could destroy someone's reputation. A nasty couplet could provoke a duel or result in outlawry. The untradition, often carved into wood or spoken aloud, was considered both insult and legal accusation. Say the wrong thing in verse 2, and you'd better have witnesses or a fast horse. Historians still argue whether these poetic laws were more about protecting personal honor or suppressing clever insults. Either way, there were rules, and this man, apparently, broke them. He denies it, of course, claiming the verse was just a joke, a phrase that has never once worked as a legal defense. The law speaker listens patiently. Then, in that slow Icelandic way, he asks if anyone heard the verse firsthand. No one did. Only retellings. That complicates things. Memory, again, is both sword and shield. Without a witness to the exact words, the case weakens. Still, the law speaker offers a compromise. The man must compose a public retraction in verse and perform it. At tonight's fire, the accused looks like he just swallowed a sea urchin. You wander off, brain buzzing. How many societies treated poetry like a lawsuit? You pass a group of teenagers, mock debating whether stepping on a neighbor's turnip patch is actionable if the turnips were already rotting. This is their fun. Later, you help someone carry firewood and ask about prisons. The man laughs so hard. He drops a log. Prisons. He wheezes. Who'd watch them? We barely have guards for the goats. He's not wrong. Medieval Iceland had no standing military, no court bailiffs, no jails. Justice meant paying a fine, being exiled Förbugsgara, or, in extreme cases, becoming Skagangra, a full outlaw. That meant anyone could kill you without punishment. You had no legal protection. It was like being deleted from the social hard drive. But even outlaws had fan clubs. Some became folk heroes, sneaking supplies, hiding in valleys, and composing verses about the injustices of their case. There's a strange respect for people who break the law, eloquently, back at camp. The sun hovers at the edge of the sky, won't fully set for hours. A crowd gathers around the fire. The man accused of slander stands nervously beside the flames. He clears his throat. Then, with the world's most reluctant barred voice, he delivers a few careful lines, praising the woman's honesty, her skill at drying fish, and how much he regrets rhyme-based confusion. The crowd applauds politely. She nods once and walks away, satisfied. And just like that, the case is over. You sit back, staring at the fire. Here, in this chilly corner of the world, laws aren't written in stone. They're spoken, sung, joked about, and passed along like stories. Every person you meet knows something about the law enough to keep things orderly, or at least amusing. And somewhere behind you, the law speaker coughs into his sleeve and mutters about how he'll be hoarse until winter. Asterisk, you wake to the smell of boiled moss and yesterday's gossip. Another day at the owl thing has begun, and already someone's loudly declaring that this time he's the one who owes me to cows. You pull on a scratchy wool cloak and stretch your legs, which feel like they've aged 20 years from sleeping on Lavaric ground. Around you, the camp stirs traders unloading bundles, children playing court with imaginary offences, and a group of elders warming their hands over a fire as they quietly recount the details of a legal case involving someone's missing boot. But today, you're shadowing a different kind of expert, the local gogi or chieftain. Not a warlord, not a judge, and certainly not royalty. He's more like a respected arbitrator with a strong memory and stronger social connections. You half expect him to carry a scroll or a ceremonial staff. Instead, he carries cheese. He offers you some. It's terrible, but you nod politely. The gogi is explaining a case as you walk with him. A man has been accused of breaking into another's food store during the harsh winter. Not to steal gold or weapons, just barley and smoked trout. The kicker, he left behind a thank you note and 2 duck feathers. The accused claims it was borrowing under duress. The plaintiff insists it's theft. You brace for a dramatic duel or a heavily cited poem. Instead, the gogi shrugs and says, "We'll settle it with a fine." That's the thing here. There are no prisons. If you commit a crime, you don't get locked away, you get fined, or exiled, or, occasionally, ignored entirely if the chieftains are tired. But most often, you pay a wergild, a compensation fee, often in livestock, silver, or goods. It's a bit like a vending machine of justice. Insert sheep, resolve conflict. But what if you can't pay? The gogi grimaces. That's when things get messy. You soon meet a man who knows that too well. He's thin, hollow-eyed, and standing near the edge of the crowd as though unsure he's welcome. You're told he's been full outlaw declared skogengar. That means no protection from the law. If someone were to attack him right now, no one would lift a finger. And yet here he is, lingering at the edges of society like smoke after a fire, asterisk his crime. A feud gone wrong. He killed a man in a quarrel over sheep grazing right scaman enough, sadly. But he couldn't pay the wergild. His family disowned him. So now he wanders the valleys, living in caves, occasionally sneaking into gatherings like this one just to hear voices and see firelight. You don't know what to say to him. He seems neither evil nor regretful, just worn down. He tells you he sometimes dreams of the laws, like lullabies. In one dream, he's back at home, reciting rules about fencing heights, while his children nod off to sleep. In another, he's forgotten the part about land inheritance, and the dream collapses into wind and snow. Historians still argue whether this outlaw system was humane or cruel. Some praise it as non-violent, a bloodless way to remove danger. Others point out it left people to starve in the wild. Either way, it worked for a while. Outlaws were expected to disappear. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they became legends. You return to the camp, mulling over the idea of justice without incarceration. The Gogi meets you again and offers more cheese. You decline. He invites you to sit in on another case, this time involving a man accused of witchcraft, though here it's not called that. The charge is using hidden knowledge with intent to harm. Apparently, someone fell ill after drinking ale he'd brewed, and rumors spread that he'd cursed the barrel. You prepare for drama. The man denies it, of course, and even offers to drink the same ale in front of everyone. He does. Nothing happens. Case dismissed, but not everyone's satisfied. You overhear whispers questions about what counts as proof. A woman mutters that, even if he didn't curse the ale, his eyes are too narrow to trust. Another replies that he once healed her son with a chant and dried kelp. Justice here isn't just about laws, it's about reputation, memory, community, consensus. It's slippery, but not chaotic. And it's designed to keep peace in a place where war would wipe out families too. Fast account. As you walk through the settlement, you notice that most dwellings have no locks, no barred doors. People trust or pretend to trust that the law will keep their neighbors honest. It doesn't always work, but it works often enough. That evening, someone performs a song about a famous outlaw who survived 3 winters in the Highlands. The crowd hums along. The outlaw is cast not as villain nor hero but as inevitability. A crack in the legal stone, a reminder that no system is perfect. You lie back on your bedroll, arms behind your head, and think, in this land of no prisons, people hold their laws in their heads and hearts, and sometimes in their dreams. Asterisk, you're beginning to notice something strange. Everywhere you go, people are quoting the law not like officials, but like poets. Around the breakfast fire, someone quotes a rule about debt repayments when splitting fish. In a tent downwind, 2 teenagers debate whether a dented helmet counts as damaged property, or just a funny-looking hat. Law isn't a dry thing here. It's lived, and sometimes it rhymes. You're seated now with an old man named Thorleif, who's sharpening a knife with more affection than speed. He offers you a seat beside a heap of driftwood shaped like a bench. Thorleif's beard is braided, his knees creak, and he tells you with a perfectly straight face that poetry has gotten more men into legal trouble than swords. You raise an eyebrow. He nods. Insult someone with a sword, they may bleed. Insult them with a verse, and they'll bleed twice. He's not exaggerating. In medieval Iceland, and that is, scornful poetry was a legal landmine. If you implied someone was cowardly, dishonorable, or, heaven forbid, bad at maintaining fences, and you put it in verse, it could be grounds for a lawsuit. Or worse, you wander down to the edge of a small stream, where a younger man is practicing a spoken verse while pacing in circles. He's preparing to deliver a legal accusation, not in plain words, but in a DRT to KV, TT stanza. That's old Norse court poetry, with complex syllabic rules and internal rhyme schemes that could make a modern songwriter cry. Think Shakespeare, but angrier and more likely to involve sheep, his target. A neighbor who apparently implied that his father smelled of spoiled herring and knew nothing of proper land use. The younger man is furious, but he knows the stakes. If he speaks the verse wrong, too late, or without witnesses, the case might fall apart, or even backfire. You sit on a mossy log and listen as he mutters. He struck with tongue what sword withheld. and smeared the name my father held. ... He pauses. Too dramatic, he asks. You shrug. What does your Gogi think? He sighs. He says to simplify the second half and avoid the word coward, unless I want a feud. Good advice. That's the real power of law here. It balances precision and performance. Yes, you can quote it, but you have to perform it well, especially in poetic disputes. And as odd as it sounds, this legal theatre is surprisingly structured. There are rules for when, how, and with whom you can exchange words of challenge. Say the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time. Boom, lawsuit. Possibly outlawry. Certainly a new saga. Historians still argue whether this fusion of poetry and law was practical or just deeply cultural. Some see it as a reflection of Norse oral traditions, where words held real weight. Others say it was a necessary check on slander in a world without newspapers or courts of appeal. Whatever the truth, you now understand why people speak so carefully. Here words stay. Later that day, you sit in on an actual Kaiser poetry dispute turned serious. Two brothers are feuding over inheritance, and one composed a song implying the other slept through his duties during lambing season. The room goes quiet when the verse is read. It's clever, too clever. People smirk, then go still. The older brother stands. His voice trembles, not from fear, but from barely contained rage. He accuses me of laziness in verse. But what of his debts? He spits. The Gogi lifts a hand. Do you challenge the as unlawful? Yes, and I want satisfaction. Satisfaction could mean a fine, or an apology, or in rare cases a formal duel. But not today. The Gogi rules in favor of a fine and requires the younger brother to recite a public retraction in verse form again. There's a pattern here. Say it with a rhyme, pay for it with a rhyme. The Icelandic version of poetic justice. You find yourself amused, just a little on edge. Every word you've spoken since arriving might be evidence. You wonder if tourists ever get sued. Probably not, but you wouldn't want to test it. That night, someone reads from an old scroll. It's a handwritten copy of a GRG section, one of the early attempts to put the laws to parchment. It includes a clause you hadn't heard before, that someone accused in verse must respond in verse, or risk being seen as guilty by silence. You blink. This land of lava and sheep is essentially one big legal rap battle. Still, it works. Disputes are resolved. Honor is repaired. And the community holds together, not just with threat of punishment, but with story, memory, and rhythm. As you fall asleep, you hear someone whispering lines from an old case into the dark. Maybe he's practicing, or maybe he just finds the cadence comforting. Because here, the law isn't just a set of rules. It's a song you never stop humming. Asterisk, you wake to a familiar sound now. Wind brushing over grass roofs, the soft baying of sheep, and someone nearby reciting a statute about turf wall maintenance while stirring porridge. It's oddly cozy. You stretch, slip on your boots, and head outside, where the sunlight is already casting long slanted shadows even, though it's barely mid-morning today. You're travelling inland, away from the crowds of the Althing Tord, a modest farmstead where legal education begins early, very early. You're visiting a family of farmers whose eldest son is preparing for his first formal appearance at the assembly. He's just 12. His father, a wiry man named Halder, with a sun-leathered face and the deeply patient air of someone who once had to litigate over who rightfully owned a goat's offspring. invites you to sit beside the hearth. We don't write laws here, he says. Setting down a wooden ladle, we remember them, and so begins the lesson. Winter in Iceland isn't just cold, it's endless. Dark for months, with snow piling up and little to do except mend tools, card wool, and recite songs, tales, and most importantly, laws. In many homes, children memorize legal codes the same way modern students cram for math tests. Only, instead of fractions, it's livestock fines and land division clauses. You sit quietly while the boy rattles off a statute about grazing rights on shared meadows. It's long, weirdly specific, and ends with the phrase, "unless he be a foreigner," or "the cows have gone feral." You glance at Holder. He nods proudly. "Learned that one last week. There's no parchment here, no books, just spoken words, passed down like recipes." You ask how much the boy is expected to know before his first appearance. "Enough, not to embarrass the family," Holder says with a wink. And he's not joking. In a culture where memory is everything, forgetting a clause could be socially ruinous. Entire disputes hinge on whether someone can accurately recall a bylaw involving seaweed collection or seal meat distribution. If you misquote and someone else remembers correctly, you lose credibility. If you're consistently inaccurate, people stop listening to you. And here, that's the same as vanishing. You help gather seaweed later with the familiars. That's a thing, and learn that even foraging rights have layers of legal nuance. Can you gather driftwood from another's beach if it's partially buried? What if it has a carved symbol on it? What if a seal is sleeping on it? These questions aren't just thought experiments. They're the stuff of real court cases. Historians still argue whether this deep legal memorization gave ordinary Icelanders more agency in society, or if it just created a class of informal law nerds who dominated local affairs. But one thing's clear: people knew the law. You'd never walk into a neighbor's pasture without being mentally prepared to quote Chapter 17. Clause 6, about the proper use of shared gateposts during lambing season. Later, over a modest dinner of rye bread and dried fish, the boy's mother joins in, reciting a rule about inheritance and sibling division of assets. You notice something odd. Her delivery is more polished than Halder's. You ask if she was trained. "Oh no," she says, "but my grandmother was a law speaker's cousin. We kept the words in the family." And there it is, a quiet hint of legal lineage. Not formal education, there were no universities here, but a kind of inherited authority through oral tradition. Families became repositories. Your value in a community might rest as much on what laws you could quote as on what you owned that night. You stay in their home, bundled in furs near the hearth, while snow begins to fall outside. The boy practices one last clause before bed. Something about how long a tenant can store turnips in another man's root cellar. It's more comforting than it should be. Just before sleep, you ask Holder if he thinks the law is too complicated. He shakes his head. "No, it's not complicated. It's just alive. You have to feed it." And as the wind howls faintly against the turf walls, you realize he's right. Here, in this winter-bound world of endless night and fire-lit memory, the law isn't just memorized. It's a part of the family. Asterisk. You've grown used to the rhythm of Iceland, now where disputes are settled with words, not swords, most of the time, and where laws live inside people's heads like favorite songs. But today, things shift. You're going to meet a man who helped make the law visible, not just heard. And as you soon learn, That was a turning point in Iceland's legal history, born not from convenience, but from crisis. You walk a narrow trail through frost-glazed heather to reach a settlement known for its scribes. They're not scribes in the monastery sense, no, monks here. Just clever folks with steady hands and a strong tolerance for seal-fat ink and poor lighting. The man you meet is named Kettle. He's old, nearly blind, but sharp as a fresh whalebone quill. He beckons you inside a low turf house, where the air smells like smoke, ink, and boiled sheep bones. In the corner sits a carefully wrapped sheaf of calfskin parchment. "Behold," he says, "our country's nervous breakdown, written down. It's the Gurges, or part of it, the grey goose laws. Not the bird, mind you. No one really knows why it's called that. Some say it refers to the grey colour of the parchment. Others think it's just a poetic flourish. Either way, these are Iceland's first attempts to write the law down, and it didn't happen because people got tired of memorizing things. It happened because the system started falling apart. Around the 13th century, chieftains became increasingly powerful and competitive. Alliances fractured, family feuds erupted, and suddenly, memory wasn't enough. People started arguing not just about what the law said, but what they thought someone else had remembered the law saying 20 years ago. It got messy, and people started dying. You sit cross-legged by the fire as Kettle explains that the push to write the law down wasn't a gentle evolution. It was an emergency measure. Think of it like a community deciding, after centuries of telling bedtime stories, to finally write them down because, too many kids were falling asleep with the wrong endings. The first scribe you hear about is a man named Halfli Mason, commissioned in the early 1100s to compile the law codes into one coherent document. Not an easy task. He had to gather the legal knowledge of dozens of Goga, listen to contradictory versions of key rulings, and try to translate oral rhythm into static ink. Imagine transcribing a spoken saga into a tax form. But he did it, and when that first copy was finished, it was considered a marvel, not just because it clarified things, but because it proved that law could be fixed. No more arguing about the phrasing of the goat poaching clause. There it was, in ink. Still, the written laws didn't replace the oral ones overnight. People kept reciting, debating, quoting from memories. Some even insisted the parchment versions were less reliable. Ink fades, they'd say, but a verse in your head never rots. Historians still argue whether the move to writing made justice more accessibly, more political. Some claim it helped ordinary people see the law for themselves. Others believe it gave too much power to scribes and elites who controlled the copies. You ask Kettle what he thinks. He smiles slowly and replies, "I think people feared forgetting more than they feared war. Writing was how we surrendered without admitting it." You sit with that dot. Later, he lets you hold a replica copy of a GRG's page. The calfskin is thick and stiff, the ink dark with fish oil and soot. The writing is neat, but cramped, like the words are trying to stay warm. You recognize familiar phrases from your time at the Althing. If a man is outlawed, and should the boundary be crossed without consent, you trace the words with your finger and wonder how many arguments were prevented or caused by this very ink. Kettle shows you one particular passage, then chuckles. That part's about barnfire liability. I always liked that one. He tells you that even after laws were written down, people continued to debate them like poems. The written record became a tool, not a replacement. Just another voice in the chorus of memory, as you leave his house. Kettle says something you won't forget. Writing the laws didn't make them stronger. It made us more afraid to forget them. That evening, you join a small group by a riverbank, where someone's reading aloud from a copied law book. There's a fire, some mead, and the familiar lull of repetition. But now, there's also a book on someone's lap, opened gently, as if it was sacred. And as you lie under the stars, it dawns on you, the laws were never just rules, they were a way to hold the community together. And when that community began to crack, it was the law they reached for writing it down, not to control each other, but to remember who they were. Asterisk, you wake beneath the sky, the color of old tin, with the scent of morning smoke curling in from distant turf houses. Today, your journey takes you away from the scribes and legal theorists and into something far messier, marriage. Not your own. Thank goodness, though, a woman at the last cook-fire did comment that you seem responsible enough to inherit a goat. High praise. Apparently, you're headed toward a wedding, or perhaps a negotiation that might become a wedding, depending on how the legal conversation goes. Because here, in medieval Iceland, marriage isn't just a romantic union, it's a legal merger, a contract, and a potential land transfer all in one. And every clause must be right, or someone's cousins will never speak again. You arrive at a farmstead humming with activity. A pig has been slaughtered, butter churned, fish dried. Everyone's excited. Everyone, that is, except the groom, who's nervously chewing a stalk of grass and muttering the legal terms for joint property rights under his breath. The bride, calm as a still fjord. She's seated near the fire with her mother and two aunts, reciting the stipulations of the hymenfylgja, or dowry, from home. She's practiced this. She knows what clauses apply if the marriage ends, if land is sold, if either of them becomes outlawed. It's oddly reassuring. One of the aunts notices you listening and smirks. It's not just a party, you know. This union has grazing rights attached. You nod solemnly. You don't want to be the only one here who underestimates the strategic importance of sheep. Before the ceremony, the families gather in a wide ring around the central longhouse. There's no priest. This isn't Christian Iceland yet. Instead, an elder man, likely a former Gogi, begins by publicly listing the agreement, loudly, for all to hear. Because in this society, a marriage only matters if the terms are witnessed. No privacy, no vague promises of love and loyalty, just detailed property exchanges, inheritance structures, and mutual obligations regarding livestock. You half expect someone to pull out a chalkboard and start drawing flowcharts. The bride's father recites her dowry: 1 milk cow, half a boat, 2 silver rings, and shared rights to a hayfield near the ridge. The groom's family offers a munda, or bride price, not buying the bride, but showing they have enough wealth to support the union. It's a careful balancing act, and everyone's listening. Historians still argue whether these transactions reduced women to commodities or elevated them as legal participants. Some scholars emphasize how women had legal rights to property, could initiate divorce, and could even represent themselves at the Althing. Others point to how the marriage process was deeply controlled by male relatives. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between verse and contradiction. Later, you're seated beside a pair of younger siblings who are gleefully telling each other what happens when marriages go wrong. One describes a case where a woman divorced her husband for hiding a bad tooth. He swore he could chew seal meat, she says, but she caught him softening it in milk behind the house. Apparently, that's grounds for annulment. You learn that Icelandic women could and did divorce their husbands. There were three main ways: by skilnar, mutual agreement; furbog, if one partner became an outlaw; or rttdr pi, if the husband was abusive. In any case, the woman had to recite the proper phrases 3 times, in front of witnesses, and usually at the doorway or bedside. Why the doorway? Scholars suggest it symbolized the boundary between private and public space. One woman once recited her divorce at the family fire pit, just to make a point. As the wedding feast begins, fermented lamb, flip bread, and something that might once have been cheesy. Watch the newlyweds accept gifts. One of them is a woven cloth that contains, stitched along its border, a quote from the GRGs about property rights in cases of inheritance. Romantic. By firelight. Someone retells the saga of a woman who, upon discovering her husband had lied about the number of milk cows he owned, sued for divorce, repossessed the cows and the shed, and went on to become one of the region's most successful dairy traders. The storyteller ends the tale with a wink. Marry for love, he says, but sign for land. You fall asleep that night in a loft above the longhouse, the newlywed couple already snoring in the next room, the fire crackling softly below, and you realize something. In Iceland, love isn't lawless. It's just ... legally binding, and you'd better know the right words before you say I do. Asterisk, you wake to the sound of hooves not galloping, but deliberate and slow, crunching over frozen peat. A rider has arrived from the western fjords, bundled in wool, face half hidden beneath a fur hood, saddlebags brimming with scrolls and sacks of dried fish. He doesn't say much at first, only dismounts, ties his horse with a practiced hand, and begins unloading what looks like a ledger. You follow him into a large communal hall where he greets the local gogi with a nod and offers a weather-worn wooden box. Inside, sealed oaths, letters of agreement, and 3 small bags of silver, each labeled with a scratchy rune. This, you're told, is a tax payment. You blink. A tax. Here, the gogi notices your confusion and chuckles. Yes, we pay tribute, he says, just not the kind that builds palaces. Today, you're diving into one of the less glamorous but deeply revealing realities of medieval Icelandic law. How money worked. Because unlike many medieval societies, Iceland didn't mint its own coins. There were no official currency systems, and yet brace yourself, taxes were very real. It starts with tithes, after Iceland converted to Christianity around the year 1000. The church gently but firmly introduced the tithe, a legal obligation to give a portion of your income, usually a tenth, to support the clergy, the poor, and church upkeep. It wasn't optional. If you refused, the bishop could bring a claim against you at the Althing, and no one wanted to argue with a man who could quote both scripture and local zoning laws. The rider, as it turns out, is a tithe collector. Not a church official, just a respected go-between who travels the countryside recording payments in goods, not coins. Butter, smoked lamb, homespun wool. The church accepts them all, converts them into usable wealth, and logs it carefully. You peek at his list. One man paid his tithe in dried whale meat. Another, curiously, in one acceptable verse, praising the Virgin. Creative accounting. Outside, you meet a woman named Ragnar, who explains how her family pays the tithe in salt precious, tricky to store, and worth its weight in sheep. She shows you her ledger, which is really a carved board with notches and runes indicating past payments. It's surprisingly effective. We don't need numbers, she says. We remember who's generous. But taxes weren't just for the church. Iceland's legal system also demanded a range of secular payments, compensation fines for injuries, tribute for using common pastures, and payments to chieftains in exchange for legal representation. You heard that right. If your gogi helped you at the Althing, you were expected to offer a gift or at least a sheep that didn't bite. Historians still argue whether these systems counted as taxes in the modern sense. Some insist Iceland had no state and thus no taxation. Others argue that regular tribute, enforced by law, is taxation just in woolly disguise. Either way, it worked. You wander through the settlement, noticing how debts and obligations are tracked. No vaults, no coin purses, just memory, reputation, and sometimes tally sticks. You see a boy carving a notch into a sheep's rib bone to remember an owed favor. His sister points out a turf mark on the roof that shows their family's last. Tithe season. If it rains too hard, we forget, she jokes. So we do it right the first time. Back in the hall, the tithe collector is sipping something warm and strong. He tells you about a case from last season where a man tried to pay his dues in future butter, a promise of dairy not yet churned. The case went to arbitration. The ruling: future butter is valid only if the cow can be identified by name and temperament. The man lost. The cow, apparently, was difficult. You can't help but laugh. Later, you sit beside the hearth while someone retells the old story of a man who avoided paying his taxes by disguising himself as a goat. He fooled no one, of course, and the legal response was swift. No man may wear horns and claim livestock status unless bewitched. A real clause. Possibly. And so, tax season here is more than an economic moment. It's a time of gathering, gossip, storytelling, and social calibration. Who paid in full? Who delayed? Who offered something clever and got away with it? As the firelight flickers, someone begins reciting from memory the portion of the GRGs that describes tithe law. It sounds like a chant. The words have rhythm, weight, and that strange comfort of legal poetry. You close your eyes and let it wash over you. Here, paying your dues isn't just obligation. The wind has shifted. You feel it before you hear it. The soft hush of grass bending under a colder breeze. The shift in how smoke moves from chimneys, curling sideways instead of up. It's late summer now, and with the turning season comes something every Icelander dreads and prepares for: the reckoning of land today. You find yourself trekking across rolling pasture, following two farmers and a gogi as they rewalk an old boundary line. One carries a knotted rope, the other a spade. The gogi carries nothing, just the law tucked away in his memory. They're not here to build, they're here to remember. You stop at a flat stone embedded in the earth. This, the older farmer says, is where my grandfather swore a calf went missing. He taps the rock. We called it Joe Festine, Thiefstone, and so begins. The boundary inspection, a tradition, both practical and poetic. Boundaries here aren't always marked with fences or stones. They live in stories, in rhymes passed down, in odd little landscape quirks. The pasture ends where the stream sings. Someone might say, or the edge is where the mountain frowns. The law demands clarity. Land disputes were some of the most common causes of feuds in medieval Iceland, next to sheep theft, of course. So everyone walks the lines together, recounting the inherited descriptions aloud. You trail behind as the group approaches a shallow stream. That's where the turf bent in the great freeze, says the younger farmer. My uncle called it slippery elbow. They stop, argue gently over the next segment, and then recite a boundary verse from memory. You're surprised how lyrical it is. Something about moss, ravens, and where the ice breaks twice. Historians still argue whether these poetic boundaries helped prevent conflict or created more of it. Some believe the flexible nature of oral land descriptions let communities adapt over time. Others argue it left too much open to interpretation, which, in Icelandic terms, usually means someone ends up hit with a sheep jawbone at midday. The group pauses near a lava outcrop, unpacking a meal of dried trout and hard cheese. You sit beside a sheepdog that seems unimpressed with your sense of direction. The Gogi begins reciting a famous land case from the 11th century one, involving a family who moved a boundary stone by half a foot and triggered a 3-year legal saga. They claimed it was erosion, he says, eyes twinkling. The Althing claimed it was ambition. And what happens when people can't agree on the line? Well, then things escalate. A neutral party is called, sometimes two, and in particularly bitter cases, the matter is taken to the Althing, where multiple witnesses are summoned to recite the remembered boundaries from their fathers and uncles. The more poetic your version, the more memorable land, the more persuasive. You hike onward to a boggy patch of land that smells like cold tea and disappointment. Here, the law becomes multi-literally. The stream that once separated two plots has shifted over the years. One farmer insists the border should follow the original stream. The other claims the law says wherever the stream now flows. There's a brief silence. Then the Gogi speaks. If the water has memory, it must also forget. That ends the argument for now. The sun sinks low as you return to the village. Boots heavy with mud, head heavy with verse. You overhear someone muttering the measurements of a neighbor's potato patch and realize everyone's always measuring something. Not with rulers, but with memory, with rhythm, with rhyme. That night, you dine on boiled barley and hear a woman telling her children the story of their land. She doesn't show them a map, she sings. Past the tree that hums when it rains. Past where the fox once died in chains. Down to the rocks where the moss won't grow. There lies the field our fathers know. The children nod, mouths full, already humming the lines back. And you understand now, land in Iceland isn't owned, it's remembered.